The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, a heavy cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering that screamed of old money and older expectations. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the 80th birthday of Mr. Jacob Montgomery," it read. My grandfather. A man whose legacy was built on shrewd investments and a heart that seemed to have been carved from the same cold, hard granite as his bank vaults. For a moment, I considered throwing it away, letting it join the pile of junk mail and forgotten bills on my small kitchen counter. But a deeper, more insistent voice whispered that I had to go. This was it. This was the culmination of everything I had been working towards, the final act of a play I had set in motion 5 years ago. My name is Chloe, and for the last half-decade, I've been living a carefully constructed lie. To my family, I was the black sheep, the cautionary tale. The art history major who had thrown away a prestigious education to become a barista, or so they thought. I lived in a tiny, rent-controlled apartment in a less-than-glamorous part of the city, wore clothes from thrift stores, and drove a sputtering 20-year-old car that was more rust than metal. Every call home was a carefully scripted performance of financial woes and artistic struggles. I'd sigh about the price of groceries, lament my car's latest mechanical failure, and talk about my art with a vagueness that they interpreted as a lack of success. They bought it all, hook, line, and sinker. Why wouldn't they? It fit their narrative perfectly. In the Montgomery family, success was measured in stock portfolios, property deeds, and the prestige of your last name on a donor plaque. My path was an anomaly, an embarrassment. My father, David, a man who worshipped at the altar of Wall Street, had practically disowned me when I refused to follow him into the world of finance. My mother, Charlotte, obsessed with social standing, would offer these pitying, tight-lipped smiles whenever I saw her, her eyes scanning my worn-out jeans as if they were a personal affront. My older brother, Christopher, was the golden child. A corporate lawyer with a jawline as sharp as his ambition, and a wife, Madison, who looked like she was assembled from a catalog of country club aesthetics. Then there was my aunt, Victoria, my father's sister, a woman who wielded gossip like a weapon, and her husband, Andrew, who always seemed to be smirking at some private joke, usually at someone else's expense. Their children, my cousins, were carbon copies of their parents. Ryan, the smug investment banker, and Abigail, whose entire personality seemed to be shopping. They were all sharks, circling, waiting for the scent of blood in the water, and I had been chumming that water for 5 long years. The truth was a world away from the fiction I presented. The struggling artist was, in fact, the anonymous creator behind a series of digital art collections, NFTs, that had exploded in the burgeoning crypto market. Under a pseudonym, Aria, I had created a world that collectors were desperate to own a piece of. My initial, tentative foray had snowballed into a phenomenon. The $47 million sitting in a secure, encrypted digital wallet was a secret I guarded more fiercely than my own life. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was the result of sleepless nights, relentless work, and a belief in myself that my family had tried so hard to extinguish. But wealth had brought a new, gnawing question. Was their disdain for me truly because of my perceived failure, or was it something deeper, something uglier? Would they have treated me differently if they knew? The idea for the test began as a whisper and grew into a roar. I had to know. My grandfather's 80th birthday party felt like the perfect stage. It was the biggest family event of the year, a command performance where every member of the Montgomery clan would be present, eager to display their own success and reinforce the family hierarchy. As I drove my beat-up car towards the sprawling Montgomery estate, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. The long, winding driveway was lined with luxury vehicles, Porsches, Mercedes, a gleaming Bentley. I parked my clunker at the far end of the guest parking area, tucked behind a gardener's shed, hoping no one would notice it. Walking towards the grand, columned entrance of the house, I grew up and felt like stepping onto an alien planet. The air was already thick with the murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. I could see them all through the floor-to-ceiling windows, gathered on the back terrace overlooking the manicured gardens and the Olympic-sized swimming pool. They were a constellation of wealth and privilege, and I was a dark star, about to collapse. I took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy oak door. The scent of lilies and expensive perfume washed over me. I had chosen my outfit with meticulous care. A simple, slightly faded black dress that I'd bought from a second-hand shop for $10, paired with worn-out ballet flats. My hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and my only makeup was a touch of mascara. I was a portrait of genteel poverty. The first person to spot me was my mother. Her smile, already stretched thin from her hostess duties, faltered for a fraction of a second. It was a micro-expression, but I saw it. The flash of disappointment, of embarrassment. "Chloe, darling," she said, her voice a little too bright. She glided over and gave me an air kiss, careful not to let her perfectly coiffed hair touch me. "You made it." I was worried. Worried about what, Mom? I asked, my voice deliberately flat. "Oh, the car. The distance. I wasn't sure you could afford the gas," she said, patting my arm with a hand heavy with diamond rings. It was the first jab of the night. "I managed," I replied, forcing a small smile. My father, David, was next. He stood with a group of his business associates, a glass of single malt scotch in his hand. He gave me a curt nod from across the room, a clear signal that I was not to interrupt his important conversation. That was fine. I wasn't there for him, not yet. I navigated the crowded room, feeling the weight of their gazes. I saw the whispers behind cupped hands, the quick, dismissive glances at my dress. My cousin Abigail, draped in a designer gown that probably cost more than my car, gave me a look that was a mixture of pity and disgust. "Chloe," she drawled, "I almost didn't recognize you. You look so artistic." The word hung in the air, dripping with condescension. "Thanks, Abby. You look expensive," I replied, the comeback sharper than I intended. She blinked, momentarily thrown before her boyfriend, a blandly handsome man named Tyler, steered her away with a smirk. I found a corner to stand in, nursing a glass of water, observing the spectacle. It was a well-rehearsed performance. Everyone played their part. My Uncle Andrew clapped my brother Christopher on the back, congratulating him on a recent merger. My Aunt Victoria was holding court with a group of women, her voice rising and falling in practiced cadences of feigned surprise and thinly veiled judgment. An hour bled into 2. The small talk was excruciating. I was asked a series of predictable, condescending questions. Was I still working at that little coffee shop? Was I selling any of my paintings? Did I need a little cash to tide me over? Each question was a small cut, a deliberate reminder of my place in their world. I answered them with a tired resignation that I knew they would interpret as the weariness of failure. The main event was the dinner. Long tables covered in white linen had been set up on the vast lawn, under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights. A string quartet played softly in the background. A team of caterers moved with quiet efficiency, serving appetizers that I knew cost a fortune per bite. I hadn't eaten much all day, a combination of nerves and a desire to make the eventual denial of food more poignant. My stomach rumbled in protest. As guests began to move towards the buffet line, I felt a hand on my arm. It was my brother, Christopher. "Chloe," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Look, before this goes any further, are you okay?" For a fleeting second, a flicker of hope ignited within me. Was this genuine concern? Was he the one person who saw past the facade? "I am fine, Chris. Why?" He sighed, a long, dramatic sound. "It's just, you look a little out of place. Mom's worried you're going to make a scene." The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. Make a scene? Why would I do that? "I don't know," he said, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie. "You get emotional. And frankly, your situation, it's a bit of a downer on a celebratory evening. We're all here to honor Grandpa." He gestured vaguely at my dress. "This whole starving artist thing is just not the right vibe for tonight." The coldness of his words settled deep in my bones. It wasn't concern. It was damage control. He was worried I would tarnish the pristine image of the Montgomery family. The buffet was an extravagant affair. There was a carving station with prime rib, a mountain of glistening shrimp, roasted vegetables, artisanal cheeses, and salads with ingredients I couldn't pronounce. The aroma was intoxicating, and my hunger sharpened into a painful pang. I waited, letting most of the guests go ahead of me. I watched my family fill their plates, laughing and chatting, completely oblivious to my presence. My mother, my father, my brother and his wife, my aunt, my uncle, my cousins. They all passed by, their plates piled high. Finally, I picked up a heavy porcelain plate and approached the buffet. I reached for a pair of tongs to get some salad, but a hand suddenly blocked mine. It was the head caterer, a stern-looking woman with her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked at me, then at a point just over my shoulder. I turned to see my mother, Charlotte, giving the caterer a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The caterer's expression hardened. "I am sorry, miss," the woman said, her voice professionally neutral but with an unmistakable edge. "The meal service is for registered guests only." The words hung in the air, absurd and shocking. "I am a registered guest," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I am Chloe Montgomery. I am the granddaughter of Jacob Montgomery." The caterer glanced at my mother again, who now looked away, suddenly fascinated by a floral arrangement on a nearby table. The silent instruction was clear. "My list says otherwise," the caterer said firmly, stepping in front of the food. "There seems to have been a mistake. Perhaps you should speak with the event host." My entire body went cold, then hot with a furious, surging wave of adrenaline. This was it. This was the moment. It was more brazen, more cruel than anything I could have imagined. They weren't just going to ignore me or insult me. They were going to actively deny me a meal. At my own grandfather's 80th birthday party, the symbolism was staggering. "You are not one of us. You do not deserve to break bread with us. You are not worthy of a place at the table." I looked from the caterer's impassive face to my mother's turned back. I saw my father a few feet away, watching, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He saw what was happening and did nothing. I saw Christopher across the lawn, who caught my eye for a second before looking away, a flicker of something shame, or just annoyance, in his eyes. They were all in on it, a coordinated, silent act of humiliation. They believed I was so destitute, so inconsequential, that they could simply erase me from the celebration, treating me like a wedding crasher, a beggar who had wandered in off the street. The laughter from the surrounding tables seemed to mock me, each happy sound a hammer blow to my heart. The knot in my stomach was no longer anxiety. It was a cold, hard stone of resolve. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea what was coming. The test wasn't just a test anymore. It was a verdict, and I was about to be the judge, jury, and executioner. For a long moment, I just stood there, the heavy porcelain plate feeling like a lead weight in my hand. The world seemed to slow down, the cheerful notes from the string quartet warping into a discordant, mocking tune. The ambient laughter of the guests, the clinking of silverware, the soft glow of the fairy lights, it all felt like a scene from a movie, a beautifully shot tableau of cruelty in which I was the unwilling star. Every nerve ending in my body was on fire. Humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that started in my chest and spread to the tips of my fingers, making my ears ring. But beneath the humiliation, something else was crystallizing. A profound, almost serene clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when every last shred of doubt has been burned away. This wasn't just a snub. It wasn't an oversight. It was a declaration. They had drawn a line in the sand of their perfectly manicured lawn, and I was on the wrong side. They saw me as nothing, less than nothing, a problem to be managed, a blemish to be hidden. The 5 years of my carefully constructed lie had worked better than I could have ever imagined. I had given them the perfect excuse to reveal their true selves, and they had seized it with a chilling, united enthusiasm. The test was over. They had failed spectacularly. My mother, Charlotte, finally dared to glance in my direction. Her expression was one of strained impatience, a silent plea for me to just disappear, to not make a scene, to not disrupt her perfect party. My father stood stoic, his face a mask of indifference, but I could see the tightness around his mouth. He was complicit in his silence, a coward hiding behind his status. And Christopher, he was already back to laughing with his friends. Having dismissed the entire incident, having dismissed me, as a minor inconvenience that had been dealt with. A strange calm settled over me. The trembling in my hands stopped. I carefully placed the empty plate back on the stack with a soft, deliberate clink that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of my own mind. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back. I was no longer the struggling artist, the poor relation. In that moment, I was Arya. I was a creator of worlds, a silent force in a market they couldn't even comprehend. I was worth more than all of them combined, not just in dollars, but in the simple, unassailable truth of my own self-worth, a concept they had long ago traded for stock options and social accolades. I turned away from the buffet, my gaze sweeping across the party. I saw my grandfather, Jacob, at the head table, seated on a throne-like chair. He was frail, his skin as thin and translucent as parchment, but his eyes were still sharp, missing nothing. He was watching me, a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. He was the patriarch, the one whose approval they all craved, the source of the wealth they all jockeyed to inherit. His 80th birthday, a milestone, a legacy. It was the perfect, poetic stage. My target was at the other end of the lawn, a small, raised platform where the band had been playing earlier. A microphone stood on a stand, temporarily abandoned. It was meant for the toasts, the heartfelt speeches that would soon begin, lionizing my grandfather and, by extension, the entire Montgomery dynasty. It was my turn to give a toast they would never forget. I began to walk. My movements were measured, unhurried. I didn't storm across the lawn, I glided. My worn-out ballet flats made no sound on the soft grass. With every step, I felt the persona of the meek, downtrodden Chloe shedding away like a snakeskin. I could feel the eyes on me, the whispers starting to ripple through the crowd as I veered away from the tables and towards the stage. What is she doing? Is that David's daughter, the artistic one? My mother's face was a mask of horror. She started to move towards me, her hand outstretched, but my father put a restraining hand on her arm, his expression now one of grim resignation. He knew me well enough to know that when I got this look in my eye, I could not be stopped. This was the same look I'd had when I told him I was choosing art history over economics. The same look I'd had when I packed my bags and walked out of this very house 5 years ago. I reached the small set of steps leading up to the platform and ascended. The world looked different from up here, even if it was only a few feet higher. I was no longer lost in the crowd, I was above it. The string quartet, sensing an unscheduled speech, trailed off into silence. A hush began to fall over the guests. All heads turned towards me. 150 pairs of eyes, all belonging to the city's elite, my family's friends and business partners, were now fixed on the girl in the $10 dress. I reached for the microphone, my fingers closing around the cool metal. The slight feedback it gave as I adjusted it was the only sound in the sudden, expectant silence. I looked out at the sea of faces, a blur of jewels and judgment. I found my family, all seated together at the main table, their expressions a perfect study in escalating panic. My mother looked like she was about to faint. My father's face was stone. Christopher was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, the mask of the golden boy slipping to reveal a baffled, angry young man. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the speakers, rolling across the lawn with an authority that surprised even me. It didn't crack. It didn't tremble. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chloe Montgomery. I am the guest of honor's granddaughter. I paused, letting that sink in. I could see the confusion on people's faces. They looked at my dress, at my plain appearance, and then at the opulent Montgomerys at the head table. The pieces weren't fitting together for them. "I know I am not on the official schedule of speakers," I continued, a small, wry smile touching my lips. But I felt compelled to stand up and offer a toast of my own. A special tribute not just to my grandfather on his 80th birthday, but to the entire Montgomery family. I turned my body slightly, directing my words, my entire being, towards their table. I looked each of them in the eye. "To my family," I said, raising an imaginary glass, "who have taught me so much. You've taught me about the value of appearances, about the importance of a pristine public image. And tonight, you've taught me about the true meaning of charity and compassion." The sarcasm was a delicate, razor-sharp blade, and I could see it slice into them. My Aunt Victoria's smile was frozen on her face. My Uncle Andrew's smirk had vanished. "Just a few moments ago," I went on, my voice ringing with a newfound power, "I was feeling a bit hungry. So I went to the buffet to get a plate of food. A simple plate of food at my own grandfather's birthday party. But I was denied. I was told very politely that there must have been a mistake, that I wasn't on the list, that the meal was only for, well, for the right kind of guests. A collective gasp went through the crowd. People started murmuring, looking at each other, then at my family. The air was thick with scandal. This was exactly what my mother had feared, a scene, but it was so much worse than she could have possibly imagined. "My mother, Charlotte," I said, my voice softening with mock sympathy as I looked directly at her. She looked so pained. She had to turn away. My father, David, a pillar of the community, he stood by and watched it happen, his silence a powerful statement. My brother, Christopher, the family's shining success, he simply looked away. It was a united front, a family decision. Their faces were turning from pale to red. They were trapped, pinned by the spotlight of my words, in front of everyone they sought to impress. "You see," I said, letting my gaze sweep over them, one by one. "My family has been under the impression for the last 5 years that I am a failure, a broke, struggling artist living on scraps. They believe I am poor. And tonight, they treated me exactly how they believe poor people should be treated, as if they are invisible, as if they are not worthy of basic human decency, as if they don't deserve a seat at the table or even a plate of food from the buffet." I let the accusation hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. It was a fascinating social experiment, really, and I have to thank them for their unwitting participation. I took a deep breath. This was the moment of revelation, the culmination of 5 years of secrecy, of sacrifice, of being underestimated and dismissed. "The thing is," I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in closer, "there's something my family doesn't know about me. There's a part of my life I've kept completely private. While they were pitying me, mocking my artistic struggles, and worrying that I would embarrass them, I wasn't just working at a coffee shop. I was working under a pseudonym, a name some of you in the tech and art investment world might actually recognize: Arya." I saw a flicker of recognition in a few faces in the crowd, a few of the younger, more tech-savvy guests. But my family just stared, confused. The name meant nothing to them. As Arya, I continued, the dam of my secret finally breaking. I haven't been struggling. In fact, I've been quite successful. I've sold a few pieces, digital collections, little things, enough to get by. Enough, in fact, to have amassed a personal net worth, as of this morning's market close, of $47 million. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. It was a dense, heavy vacuum, sucking all the air and polite chatter from the manicured lawn. $47 million. The number hung in the air, shimmering and impossible, a stark contrast to the $10 dress I was wearing. It was a figure they understood. It was their language. It wasn't an abstract concept of artistic success. It was a concrete, staggering sum that completely shattered their perception of me. I watched their faces, a slow-motion gallery of shock and disbelief. My father, David, who had been a statue of stoic disapproval, was the first to break. His jaw literally dropped, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. The glass of scotch, forgotten in his hand, tilted precariously. My mother, Charlotte, went deathly pale, her perfectly painted red lips a stark slash against her white skin. She clutched the pearls at her neck as if they were a lifeline, her eyes wide with a horror that was quickly being eclipsed by a dawning, frantic calculation. Christopher's reaction was the most telling. His face, which had been a mask of smug annoyance, crumpled into utter confusion. He stared at me, his brow furrowed, as if he was trying to solve an impossible equation. Madison, his wife, turned to him, her eyes wide, whispering frantically, "Did you know? Did you have any idea?" His helpless shake of the head was all the answer she needed. My Aunt Victoria's mouth was a thin, hard line of outrage, her mind no doubt racing to spin this, to comprehend how the family's charity case had just upstaged every single person at the party. The guests were a murmuring sea of astonishment. Whispers erupted like wildfire. "Arya, 47 million, David Montgomery's daughter." I had seized control of the narrative, ripped it from their hands, and rewritten it in bold, undeniable print. They were no longer the stars of this opulent celebration. They were supporting characters in my story, and they were the villains. I let the silence stretch for another beat, enjoying the exquisite torture of their cognitive dissonance. Then, I continued, my voice calm and deliberate, a surgeon making a precise incision. So you see, this whole evening has been illuminating, I said, my gaze sweeping over my family once more. For 5 years, I wanted to know. I wanted to see if the love and respect of my family was conditional. I wondered, if I wasn't a Montgomery in the way you understood it, wealthy, successful, in the right profession, would you still be there for me? Would you still love me? I constructed a life of perceived failure to find the answer. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice into a more intimate, conspiratorial tone, forcing them to strain to hear. I want to thank you sincerely. Thank you for giving me the answer. It is so much clearer than I ever could have hoped for. When you thought I had nothing, you treated me as if I was nothing. You mocked me, you pitied me, you were ashamed of me. And tonight, you denied me a plate of food at my own grandfather's table because you were embarrassed by my perceived poverty. I straightened up, my voice regaining its strength. The test is over. You all failed, miserably. That was the final blow. The word test hung them on the hooks of their own making. It reframed their cruelty not as a passive consequence of their values, but as an active failure of their character. And so, I said, bringing the toast to its devastating conclusion, as a result of this test, and as a gesture to honor the values of decency and compassion that you so clearly lack, I am making another announcement. I paused, making sure I had every single person's undivided attention. I looked past my family to the head of the table, where my grandfather Jacob sat watching, his expression unreadable, his old eyes fixed on mine. I am announcing that effective immediately, every single member of my immediate family, my father, David, my mother, Charlotte, my brother, Christopher, along with my Aunt Victoria, my Uncle Andrew, and my cousins Ryan and Abigail, are hereby disinherited. Not from my grandfather's will, of course. That's his decision. I gave a brief nod towards the old man. You are disinherited from me. You will not receive a single dollar of my 47 million. You will not be a part of my life, my future, or my success. You had your chance to be a family to me when you thought I had nothing. You chose not to be. So now, when I have everything, I am choosing not to be family to you. The collective intake of breath was audible across the lawn. This was no longer just a scene. This was a schism, a public, brutal severing of family ties. So let's all raise a glass, I concluded, finally picking up a nearby water goblet from the stage and holding it high. To my grandfather, Jacob, happy 80th birthday. May you be surrounded by people who love you for who you are, not for what you have. And a final toast to honesty. It's so much more valuable than money. With that, I placed the microphone back in its stand, the soft thud echoing the final nail in the coffin of my old life. I turned, walked calmly to the edge of the small stage, and stepped down onto the grass. I did not look back. The silence I left behind was quickly shattered. A cacophony of voices erupted. But I didn't stop. I walked with a steady, determined pace, heading not for the exit, but for my grandfather's table. The crowd of guests parted for me like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of awe, pity, and morbid fascination. They were witnessing the implosion of one of the city's most powerful families. As I approached the head table, my father shot up from his chair. "Chloe, you stop right there. What in God's name do you think you're doing?" His voice was a strangled roar of fury and utter humiliation. I didn't even break my stride. I didn't look at him. My focus was solely on the old man at the end of the table. My mother was already sobbing, a theatrical, gulping sound. "How could you do this to us? To your family? In front of all these people?" Christopher was on his feet too, his face purple with rage. "This is insane. You're insane. You made all that up. 47 million. You're a barista. You're lying to humiliate us." "Am I?" I said softly, finally stopping beside my grandfather's chair. I reached into the small, worn purse I carried and pulled out my phone. With a few taps, I brought up the dashboard of my encrypted wallet, the balance clearly displayed in crisp, glowing numbers. $47,138,224.37. I didn't show it to Christopher. I angled the screen so that only my grandfather could see it. He leaned in, his frail body trembling slightly. He squinted at the screen, his sharp eyes taking in the figure. He looked from the phone, up to my face, and then back to the phone. A slow, strange smile spread across his wrinkled face. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile of grim satisfaction, of respect. The smile of one shark recognizing another. He then looked up at my father, my mother, my brother, who were all standing there, frozen in a tableau of greed and fury. "Sit down," Jacob said. His voice was raspy with age, but it carried an undeniable authority that had commanded boardrooms and silenced arguments for 60 years. "All of you, sit down, now." Reluctantly, like chastised children, David, Charlotte, and Christopher sank back into their chairs. The eyes of every guest were on them, on us. The party was over. The trial had begun. So my grandfather said, his gaze returning to me, "Arya, that's clever." "I thought so," I replied, my voice quiet, for his ears only. "And this test," he continued, gesturing vaguely with a trembling hand towards the rest of the family. "This was their final exam." "It was," I said, "and the results are in." He nodded slowly, his eyes seeming to look through me, back across the decades of his own life, a life filled with similar tests, with betrayals and calculations. He had built his empire by understanding the precise intersection of love and money, loyalty and leverage. "You have my fire," he wheezed, a note of something that sounded almost like pride in his voice. "More than your father ever did." He then looked back at my father and his expression hardened. "David, you raised a fool and a lioness, but you only paid attention to the fool." My father flinched as if he'd been struck. My mother let out another choked sob. I knew this was just the beginning. The public humiliation was the opening salvo. The real war would be fought behind closed doors. They wouldn't let go of $47 million easily. Their shock and rage would soon curdle into something else, a desperate, fawning avarice. They would try to reason, to bargain, to guilt, to threaten. They would try to claw their way back into my life, not because they loved me, but because they loved what I had. But as I stood there, beside the patriarch of a family I no longer claimed, looking at their shattered faces, I felt nothing but a profound and liberating emptiness. The pain that had been my constant companion for 5 years was gone. The desperate need for their approval, the hurt of their rejection, it had all been cauterized in the fire of my speech. I had cut the rod out, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely and utterly free. The battle was coming, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that I had already won the war. My grandfather's words hung in the air, a final, damning verdict delivered by the highest judge in their world. My father, David, looked as though Jacob's pronouncement had physically struck him, his face slack with shock, the fury momentarily extinguished by the sheer weight of his father's disappointment. My mother simply wilted, her sobs becoming quiet, helpless whimpers. For them, public humiliation was a fate worse than death, and to be shamed by the patriarch himself, in front of their entire social circle, was an unrecoverable blow. I gave my grandfather a single, slow nod. An understanding passed between us in that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of a shared, ruthless pragmatism. He had built an empire by cutting away weakness, and he recognized the same instinct in me. I had simply applied it to the family tree. Without another word to anyone, I turned. My back was straight, my head held high. I began my long walk across the lawn, away from the head table, away from the wreckage of my former life. The guests, who had been frozen in place, now seemed to stir, their whispers following me like the rustling of leaves. They parted before me, their faces a gallery of expressions: shock, admiration, pity for my family, and a raw, hungry curiosity. I was the story they would be dining out on for months. My family remained at the table, pinned there by shame and my grandfather's command. I could feel their eyes on my back, burning with a mixture of hatred and a new, terrifying avarice. I didn't look back. Looking back would be a betrayal of the freedom I had just claimed. I walked past the twinkling lights, the extravagant floral displays, the string quartet that had fallen silent. I walked past the untouched buffet, a monument to the petty cruelty that had started it all. I didn't stop until I reached the heavy oak doors of the main house. I slipped through them, the sudden quiet of the grand foyer a welcome relief. My footsteps echoed on the marble as I walked out the front door and into the cool night air. The valet, a young man who had studiously avoided my gaze when I arrived, now stared at me with wide, respectful eyes. He had probably heard everything. "My car," I asked, my voice even. "The old, beat-up one, parked by the shed." He practically tripped over himself to go and get it. As I waited, the first wave of reaction hit me. A deep, shuddering tremor ran through my body. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the past hour began to recede, leaving a hollow, aching void in its place. The triumph was real, a heady, intoxicating feeling of power. But underneath it was a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow. I had just detonated my own life, and the fallout was only just beginning. I hadn't just disinherited them from my money. I had orphaned myself. I had no mother, no father, no brother. The grief for the family I always wished Id had, the family I had given one last chance to exist, washed over me in a cold, painful wave. The sputtering engine of my car broke the silence. The valet pulled it up to the grand entrance, its rusted, dented body looking almost comically out of place. He held the door open for me as if it were a Rolls-Royce. I got in, the familiar scent of old upholstery a strange comfort. "Thank you," I said, and for the first time that night, I smiled a genuine, small smile. The drive away from the estate was surreal. In my rearview mirror, the magnificent house, ablaze with light, grew smaller and smaller until it was just another star in the darkness. I drove through the sleeping, opulent suburbs, a ghost in a junk heap machine, leaving a world of wealth I had just claimed and rejected in the same breath. By the time I reached the highway, the tears I had been holding back finally came. They weren't tears of regret, but of release. I cried for the little girl who had tried so desperately to earn her father's approval. I cried for the teenager who never felt she could measure up to her perfect brother. I cried for the young woman who had to hide her success for fear it was the only thing that would make her family love her. I was mourning a fantasy, the death of a hope I hadn't even realized I was still clinging to. When I finally walked into my small, cluttered apartment an hour later, the silence was deafening. This tiny space, which had been my refuge and my secret keeper for 5 years, suddenly felt like the loneliest place on earth. I dropped my keys on the counter and leaned against the door, completely drained. Then my phone buzzed, and then again, and again. A relentless, frantic series of notifications lighting up the screen. I picked it up with a sense of dread. The first was a text from my mother. "Chloe, my darling girl, please, please call me. This has all been a terrible, horrible misunderstanding. We love you more than words can say. My heart is broken. Please, let's just talk." A minute later, a text from Christopher. "You have 5 minutes to call me and explain what the hell that was before I come over there. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Then an email, the subject line in all caps, "From your father." The body of the email contained a single, chilling sentence: "You have made a grave mistake." The barrage was just beginning. Voicemails started piling up. My mother, sobbing hysterically. Christopher alternating between threats and furious, baffled questions. Aunt Victoria, leaving a message dripping with venom and false concern, demanding to know if I was unwell. They were scrambling, their shock and humiliation rapidly morphing into a desperate, multi-pronged attack of guilt, intimidation, and emotional blackmail. I stared at the phone, at their names flashing on the screen. These people who, just hours before, wouldn't have spared me a thought, were now desperately clawing for my attention. The irony was so bitter it tasted like acid. They weren't horrified that they had hurt me. They were horrified that they had miscalculated. They had bet on the wrong horse, and now they were trying to change their wager after the race was over. With a flick of my thumb, I powered the phone off. The sudden silence was a blessing. I would not be manipulated. I would not be intimidated. I had made my declaration, and I would stand by it. The years of playing weak were over. I went to my laptop, my fingers seeking the familiar comfort of the keyboard. For a moment, I considered losing myself in my art, in the digital world of Aria where I was in complete control. But I knew I couldn't hide. I had to face my new reality head-on. Instead of opening my design software, I opened a web browser. I typed in the name of the most exclusive real estate agency in the city. I started browsing. Penthouses with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. Historic brownstones on quiet, tree-lined streets. Sprawling modern lofts that could house a design studio 10 times the size of my entire apartment. For years, I had lived with less, convincing myself that material things didn't matter. But now, I saw them for what they could be. A fortress. A tangible barrier between my new life and the people who wanted to drag me back into the old one. This wasn't about extravagance. It was about security. It was about creating a space so far removed from my past that they could never touch me again. I was scrolling through a listing for a stunning duplex with a private rooftop garden when a call came through on my laptop. It was an encrypted, numberless call, a service I used for my high-end clients. My heart skipped a beat. Only a handful of people had this contact information. Hesitantly, I answered. Hello. Is this Arya? The voice was old, raspy, and utterly unmistakable. It was my grandfather. I sat up straighter, my mind racing. How had he gotten this number? Then I remembered. His investment firm had been one of the early, anonymous institutional buyers of my second collection. He must have done his homework. He was more thorough than I had ever given him credit for. It's Chloe, grandfather, I replied, my voice steady. There was a dry chuckle on the other end of the line. No, I think I was right the first time. The girl named Chloe left my party hours ago. I believe I am speaking to Arya. What do you want? I asked, cutting to the chase. I was in no mood for games. Direct, I like that, he rasped. I wanted to tell you that what you did tonight, it was the most interesting thing to happen in the Montgomery family in 50 years. You have your grandmother's courage, and my ruthlessness. It's a potent combination. Is that a compliment? It is an observation, he corrected. They will not give up, you know. Your father is a fool, but he is a persistent one. Your mother will try to drown you in tears and guilt. They will use every weapon they have to get to that money. Let them try, I said, a cold resolve in my voice. They will fail, he stated, not as a prediction, but as a fact. Because they are playing checkers and you, my dear, are playing chess, just as I taught you. I remembered the summers he had spent teaching me the game as a child, his gnarled fingers moving the pieces, explaining strategy, sacrifice, and the importance of thinking 10 moves ahead. My family had thought it was just an old man's pastime. I realized now it had been a lesson. I have a proposition for you, Arya, he said, his voice dropping lower. Your father has run my company into the ground with his safe, predictable strategies. He lacks vision. He lacks courage. He lacks the killer instinct. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. That 47 million is a remarkable achievement, but it is a fraction of what you could do with a real empire behind you. I am officially retiring. The board is expecting David to take over, but I am still the majority shareholder. My vote is the only one that matters. The line went quiet for a moment, and I held my breath, knowing what was coming next. The money is an asset, my grandfather said, his voice as sharp and clear as cut glass. But the mind that made it is the real prize. I want that mind running Montgomery Enterprises. I want you in my chair. The company is yours, Chloe, if you want it. The offer settled not with a bang, but with a profound, earth-shaking silence. The company is yours if you want it. My grandfather's words, raspy and faint over the encrypted line, were a gravity well, pulling every thought, every emotion, every alternative future into their orbit. It was the ultimate checkmate. The final, perfect revenge. To not only triumph over my father, but to usurp him, to sit in the very chair he had spent his entire life working towards, the chair he felt was his birthright. I could picture it with perfect, painful clarity, walking into the Montgomery Enterprises boardroom, the shock on the faces of the executives, the utter soul-crushing humiliation of my father having to answer to me. I could dismantle his legacy, piece by piece. I could rewrite the family history with myself at the helm. It was a revenge so total, so poetic, it made my head spin. For a long, intoxicating moment, I let myself savor it. I let the fantasy play out, the dark, satisfying thrill of it washing over me. This was power. This was the language my family understood. To win on their terms, to beat them at their own game so completely that they could never recover. My grandfather knew exactly what he was offering. He wasn't just offering a company, he was offering a crown, a scepter, and the heads of my enemies on a platter. But as the initial rush of adrenaline faded, a colder, clearer thought pierced through the haze of vengeance. What would happen the day after? And the day after that? I would be chained to that desk, to that boardroom. I would spend my days in endless meetings, analyzing profit margins and quarterly reports. I would have to navigate the murky politics of the corporate world, a world I had actively fled 5 years ago. My life would become a series of strategic maneuvers, of calculated risks and leveraged assets. I would be surrounded by the same people who had applauded my family's success and pitied my failure. The art, the creativity, the freedom that Arya had given me would wither and die under the fluorescent lights of a corner office. In my quest to defeat them, I would become them. I would become the new Jacob. A ruthless, calculating monarch ruling over an empire of things I didn't care about, all to prove a point that I had already so spectacularly made. The silence had stretched on for too long. Why? I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why me? Because you're a builder, he rasped. Your father is a custodian, he maintains. He is afraid to risk, so he is doomed to shrink. You built a $47 million fortune from nothing but an idea in your head. You did it in secret under their noses. You have the vision and you have the stomach for a fight. The company needs a builder, not a custodian. It needs a shark, and the pond is full of guppies. His words were a potent lure, but the picture in my mind was clearer now. The penthouse I had been looking at online wasn't a corporate headquarters. It was a studio. The life I envisioned wasn't filled with board members. It was filled with light and color and the boundless possibility of creation. I had spent 5 years creating a life for myself, an identity that was wholly mine. Why would I trade it for one that was theirs? I need to think about it, I said, my voice noncommittal. Take your time, he said, though we both knew the offer had an unspoken deadline. But lock your door. The hyenas are coming. He disconnected the call, leaving me in the echoing silence of my apartment. The hyenas are coming. A chill went down my spine. He was right. My family wouldn't be content with phone calls and texts for long. Their desperation would drive them to my doorstep. As if on cue, a loud, frantic banging began at my apartment door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was an assault, a furious, entitled pounding that rattled the cheap wood in its frame. Chloe, open this door right now. We know you're in there. It was Christopher's voice, laced with a rage that had completely eclipsed his usual smug composure. I took a deep breath, stood up from my laptop, and walked to the door. I looked through the peephole. My brother was there, his face red and contorted. Behind him, my mother was weeping, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, while my father stood stiffly, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face a thunderous mask of fury. This was it, the final confrontation. I slid the deadbolt open and pulled the door inward just enough to see them. They looked pathetic, a tragic portrait of fallen royalty crowded in the dingy, poorly lit hallway of my building. What do you want? I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. What do we want? Christopher sputtered, incredulous. What do we want? An explanation, an apology. You humiliated us. You humiliated the entire family. My mother pushed past him, her face a mess of smeared mascara and desperation. Chloe, darling, please, she cried, reaching for my arm. I stepped back and her hand fell away. It was all a misunderstanding, a terrible mistake. We would never, ever have treated you that way if we had known. We love you. The words were so transparently false, so grotesquely self-serving that I almost laughed. If you had known, I repeated, my voice flat, so you admit it. You would have treated me differently if you'd known I had money. That's the whole point. Your love, your respect, it all has a price tag, and you thought I couldn't afford it. My father finally spoke, stepping forward to loom over me, his voice a low growl. You have made your point, Chloe. You had your little tantrum, you embarrassed us all. Now it's time to stop this foolishness and act like a Montgomery. Your grandfather called me. He told me about his ludicrous offer. This ends now. You will come home, you will make a public apology for your outburst, and we will handle this situation as a family. Handle this situation? I asked, a slow, cold anger building in me. You mean handle my money? You mean figure out how to get your hands on it. This is not about money, he thundered. This is about loyalty. This is about family. No, I said, my voice ringing with finality in the small hallway. This was about family. It was my last attempt to see if I had one. And you gave me my answer. You are not my family. You are just the people I unfortunately share DNA with. Your apologies are worthless because you aren't sorry for what you did. You're sorry for who you did it to. You're sorry you misjudged an asset. I looked at each of them, at their desperate, greedy faces. The mother who valued appearances over her own daughter. The father who saw love as a transaction. The brother who saw me as an obstacle to his own ambition. The sorrow I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a profound, cleansing certainty. I am not coming home, I told them. I will not be making an apology, and you will never see a single cent of my money. The test is over. This conversation is over. Goodbye. Before they could react, I closed the door in their faces. I slid the deadbolt home, the solid thunk the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I could hear them shouting, pounding on the door again, but it was just noise now. Their power over me was broken. I leaned against the door, my heart hammering, but my mind was perfectly calm. I walked back to my laptop, and with steady fingers, dialed my grandfather's number. He answered on the first ring. Arya. I have my answer, I said. There was a pause on the other end, and, thank you for the offer, grandfather, I said, my voice clear and strong. It's the greatest compliment you could have possibly given me, and thank you for teaching me how to play chess. But I am declining the position. I could almost hear his sharp intake of breath. You're turning it down, an empire. For what? For my own empire, I said. Montgomery Enterprises is your world. You built it, you mastered it. But it's not mine. I spent the last 5 years building a world of my own, and I'm not going to abandon it now. I don't want to be the new Jacob Montgomery. I want to be the first Arya. The line was silent for a long time. I thought perhaps he had hung up, that I had finally crossed a line and offended his dynastic pride. But then I heard it. A low, raspy sound. A dry chuckle of what sounded, impossibly, like genuine admiration. Your grandmother would have liked you, he said softly. She always did things her own way, too. Very well, Arya, go build your empire. He hung up, and that was that. I had been offered the world I had been raised to covet, and I had turned it down. The feeling was not of loss, but of an immense, breathtaking liberation. 6 months later, the sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new home. It was a penthouse, just like the one I had browsed online that night, a sprawling duplex of glass and steel and light that served as both my home and my studio. The city spread out below me, a glittering tapestry of possibilities. My old apartment, my old life, felt like a distant dream. My family had eventually given up. After a few weeks of desperate calls and even a threatening letter from their lawyer, which my own, far more formidable lawyer had dismissed in a single sentence, they had retreated into silence. Left to lick their wounds and explain the scandalous implosion of their family to their social circle. I heard through the grapevine that my father's position at the company was precarious, that the board was questioning his leadership. But it was no longer my concern. My phone buzzed, not with a frantic plea from a life I'd left behind, but with a notification from the Arya Foundation, the charity I had established to fund arts education for underprivileged kids. It was a message from the first recipient of our scholarship, a young girl from the Bronx with a talent for digital animation, her words overflowing with a gratitude that felt more real and valuable than any number in a bank account. I looked away from the screen, towards the large digital canvas where my newest creation was taking shape, a swirling, complex world of light and shadow, of courage and reinvention. I was no longer Chloe, the disappointment. I was not Chloe, the vengeful heiress. I was Arya, a creator, a builder of my own world on my own terms. And as I picked up my stylus to make the first mark of the day, I felt a sense of peace that was worth more than any fortune. I was finally and completely free.